2021 aims to be a year of transformative change to halt biodiversity loss. The losses are really alarming. More than 1 million plant species and animal species are at risk of extinction. We heard at the weekend that the G7 leaders committed to protecting and conserving 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. Now, that was a target that 50 other countries had agreed with and is in line with the EU's Green Deal ambition. But much more needs to be done. And all eyes are on the COP15, the Conference to the Parties of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, that's in Kunming in China. But if we look at the COP10, they set targets, the HE targets, and most of them were missed, although those for protected areas fared a little bit better than many others. There are so many pressures on protected and conserved areas. We know the demographic trends, the economic trends, and these ecosystems are degrading rapidly. What we're going to hear in the high-level panel is the role of these protected and conserved areas. And it's not just for people and the planet, but it's for putting people at the heart of these conservation efforts. We've got to make sure that they can have livelihoods and lives. And there is, after all, an economic case for protecting and conserving these areas. They are our ecosystem services. They provide food, water, medicine, and of course act as carbon sinks. But if we are going to meet the new or the hoped for target of 30 by 30, we're going to need new funding. Traditional streams of funding are just not going to work. So we're going to have to look for alternative funding. This is what the high-level panel is going to discuss. The pressures on biodiversity loss, the role of protected and conserved areas, and how are we going to fund these going forward. And we're going to hear from some world-leading conservationists from Lebanon, South Africa, and Europe. And I'm now going to hand over to that panel now to begin.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to introduce this session today at the European Development Days. This will be an important discussion on the pressures on biodiversity and the role protected areas in the solution. Healthy nature shapes the environment and the climate in which humanity can thrive. Science is telling us that biodiversity, the unique fabric of life on Earth, is under intolerable strain. Decades of unsustainable human activities have changed our climate, altered ecosystems, polluted our environment, overexploited species, and caused the spread of invasive alien species. If we continue down this path, we risk irreparable damage to the foundations of our well-being and prosperity, and undermine our chances of coping with climate change. Today, more than 1 million species at a risk of extinction, and the majority of global ecosystems are now degraded. We have the responsibility to halt biodiversity loss, and we have the means to do so. If we fail to change our approach, climate change and deteriorating ecosystems will severely limit our options. Future generations expect from us ambitious action, and this is what we are putting forward with the European Green Deal. Europe set out its ambitions in the EU biodiversity strategy, and we are mapping out a path to achieve them. We are making progress on the implementation of the 100+ actions which we committed to deliver by 2030. The Commission has drafted guidance and engaged with authorities and stakeholders in the design of measures to implement the EU biodiversity commitments. We have made progress in preparing new legislation and strategies on a range of topics, from nature restoration to forests and soil. But it's not a path we can travel alone. We need to work in tandem with many partners and in particular external partners. Commissioner Urpilainen and I are working closely, mobilizing our external funding and policies to support the world's biodiversity and forests. The process for preparing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity in China is gathering speed. The EU has positioned itself as a global leader. We now have to leverage this position and build a coalition for a global biodiversity framework that can achieve the vision of living in harmony with nature, in tandem with the world's efforts to tackle climate change. By 2030, this framework must set nature on a road to recovery, enabling us to achieve our 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. We need a Paris movement for biodiversity addressing the three main objectives of the Convention: conservation, sustainable use, and access to, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits deriving from the use of genetic resources. One of the key targets should be protecting 30% of lands and seas. This should be complemented by other measurable targets as for the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. In parallel to setting ambitious objectives, we also need a strong mechanism for monitoring and review. We need to be able to review their implementation and ratchet up efforts if needed. This would increase trust, adding transparency on parties, actions, and implementation over time. That includes international and domestic financing from public and private sectors. Phasing out harmful subsidies and ensuring efficient spending will be key to success. All around the globe, putting forward the right means through resource mobilization as official development assistant plays a crucial role. When it comes to financing for biodiversity, the EU is proud to be a major donor, and we are seeing some notable results. And we are happy to be aligned here with other donors from around the globe. We must ensure the use of these funds is targeted and effective. Whether you are a minister or a youth leader, a government official or an aid worker, a stakeholder or a colleague in the EU external services, your help and engagement is essential. The Commission is determined to work with you, and I invite you to work with us. The road ahead will not always be straight, and it certainly won't be easy. But there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic. With the European Green Deal, we have new political momentum. We need to rally government and NGOs, the public and all stakeholders behind transformative action to protect our nature. That's the spirit of these European Development Days. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me. Apologies for the technical delay there. Good to see you all. Thank you so much for joining this excellent panel. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And thank you very much, Claire, for handing over. My name is Sandra Gatman. I work at Al Jazeera. I'm a journalist, and I host a show called Start Here. Our aim is to explain world news in a really simple way so that we can engage as many people as possible. And I would love for us to kind of keep that approach in mind as we discuss protected areas and resource mobilization. I think the battle to protect diversity just doesn't get the same war cry that the battle against climate change does. And we really can't tackle one without the other. So with that in mind, I would love to introduce our panelists. We could start with Malta QWATHEKANA, who's a senior policy advisor at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment of South Africa. Good to have you on the panel. Dr. Sandy ANDELMAN, she's Vice President of Conservation Strategy and Partnerships at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Good to have you with us. Rita Boutros, Rita's a biologist and one of our youth leaders from Lebanon. Thank you for joining. And last but not least, of course, Humberto Delgado Rosa is Director at Natural Capital and DG Environment at the European Commission. Great to have you all. Let's get stuck in. We don't have too much time. Humberto, let's start with you. I think at a political level, we are seeing some progress, aren't we? We had G7 leaders agree on this nature compact recently. There is more traction behind this idea that we're fighting this twin war between climate change and biodiversity. But are we still at an early stage, you think, in terms of real momentum to make biodiversity targets a priority?
Well, hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to join you. I would like to say on this topic, well, we have always the glass half full or half empty. And I think it's now half full and tending to get fuller. I mean, indeed, this close link between climate change and biodiversity losses, two twin problems that cannot be disentangled, has grown a lot in political attention. And I think that comes from public opinion noticing. We have, of course, the climate impacts, but we do have some other biodiversity-related impacts, some in common with climate change if you think of forest fires. But if you think of the loss of insects and pollinators in many places in the world, including Europe, or plastic in the ocean that has quite a toll on marine life, this has raised the stakes. So I think this trend towards both the climate COP26, which the UK presidency announces as a nature-related COP also through the nature-based solutions for climate, but also the COP15 of the Convention of Biological Diversity, they should both be a success in terms of ambition. Now, if I can just add an element on what ambition entails. We've heard our commissioner. I would just reinforce the following. It's true that the IG targets would not really deliver it, but as we heard in the introduction, one that fared a bit better was on protected areas. Why was that? Well, there was a number attached. It had a measurability, it didn't end it. So we do think that overall we need more measurable targets, including on conservations as the protected areas, but on sustainable use, on other elements of the convention that are important. But certainly protected areas, an increase in protected areas will be very crucial. And the EU has shown to be ready to do its part, as from our biodiversity strategy to 2030, in which we announced we aim at 30% of land and sea of the EU to be protected, 1/3 of which strictly protected. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Humberto. Sandy, I want to throw it over to you. Can you help us get our minds around the idea of nature-based solutions? It's a term that's thrown around a lot, but probably one of the most effective ways to ensure the protection of natural areas.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here. So the basic idea behind nature-based solutions is, for example, 37% of the solution to climate change is by protecting and retaining the existing intact ecosystems, especially forests. And it's a very cost-effective approach. In doing that, we're protecting not only the carbon stocks in those forests, but also the biodiversity and all the relationships in that forest. And people, especially vulnerable communities who live around those areas, are receiving benefits: clean water, medicinal plants, food, protection from erosion. A great example is Rwanda. During the conflict in Rwanda, the country lost most of its natural forests, and the remaining forests are largely in 3 protected areas. In between is mostly agriculture on very steep slopes. What's happening now with climate change is that intense periods of rain are causing landslides, flooding, loss of crops, loss of homes, loss of lives. So the Wildlife Conservation Society has partnered with the government of Rwanda, local communities, and the Green Climate Fund, and we're embarking on a major new project to reconnect those 3 forest blocks in a way that protects people from extreme climatic events driven by climate change, and that also provides a way for those forests to be resilient and for the wildlife in those forests, like mountain gorillas and chimpanzees, to be able to move between them in response to climate change. So we're creating a solution that's good for nature, but it's also good for people.
Thanks so much, Sandy. Great to hear that example on Rwanda as well. And Malta, it's great to have you on the panel too, because we can really get that kind of national perspective on these challenges. And South Africa has a huge agricultural sector. It's really the star of your economy in some ways, which makes your job of trying to guard these natural areas incredibly difficult. How are you doing it?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. And good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Yes, South Africa has got a huge role to play. I must start from the fact that protected areas still are the only way of conserving, only effective way for conserving biological diversity up to this far. But that depends on how they have been set or proclaimed and how they are managed, as well as the availability of resources to make sure that they are properly maintained. Therefore, although they are the key tools to protect biological diversity, that depends. Therefore, there must be very good way of setting them, establishing them, engaging communities, doing adequate consultation, and ensuring that the human needs are taken into account. Secondly, once they are set, we must ensure that they are properly managed and effectively managed with adequate resources to ensure that the infrastructure that is required is appropriate. So what is happening in South Africa currently? We had a target of 17 by 10 in 2010, like the earlier speaker has indicated. Of that 17%, we have managed to achieve 15.2 as to date. That includes formally protected areas, as well as other effective area-based conservation measures, such as botanic gardens, such as the stewardships, such as the biosphere reserves, such as the conservancies. All that added together amounts to 15.2% of our land, which is over 1 million square kilometers in size, the whole of South Africa. In the ocean, in 2010, it was agreed that nations must protect 10% of their ocean, of their marine environment. Up to this far, South Africa has managed to protect 5.4%, meaning in the ocean we are owing about 4.6%. And on land, we are owing about 1.8% of our land in order to achieve the Aichi biodiversity target that was agreed in 2010 in Japan. What does that mean for us? That means for us, when we add the new target of post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we will be adding it into the already target that we still need to achieve from the Aichi biodiversity targets. Now, going back to the state of the current protected areas, we are trying our best through national budgets and otherwise to ensure that our protected areas and all the other effective area-based conservation measures are adequately and effectively managed through our national budgets and other means, such as the GEF. However, all those conservation and protected areas are in a state that still require to be revisited, not properly managed. Lack of infrastructure, lack of capacity, lack of the adequate means to ensure that they are effectively protected. That means, therefore, although we will need funding to achieve the target that will be agreed in China, we will also need resources to ensure that the current protected areas are effectively managed. Because you can have vast areas of land under protection, but if they are not effectively managed and adequately protected, then it doesn't serve the conservation objective. Also, the other qualitative means that were agreed upon in Japan, such as ecological representativity, the equity, you name them, all the other, the qualitative aspects of Target 11, they are still pending and require to be looked after in the existing protected areas. So those are the issues we in South Africa are seriously considering that we need to take care of. And also we have got land issues, land ownership issues. We have got land claim issues, which are a result of the past historical and political issues that existed in our country. So we are resolving such issues within protected areas and outside protected areas. There are protected areas that are already declared as formal protected areas, but which are heavily contested by the neighboring communities because they have land claims over such protected land. So those are the challenges we are facing, which we will need to ensure that they are resolved before we can even consider whether we can have additional land and additional marine areas that are declared for protection. So the protection of both our marine and terrestrial is very crucial and key to us. And we are having heavy national allocations, and we are raising funds and resources to ensure that we increase the protection of our land as well as the protection of our oceans adequately. And we support the increased percentage in the protection of the land, but with caution because of all these other issues that I have laid above. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Malta. And I would love to get the other panelists to address some of those challenges you raised in a bit. But Rita, I want to come to you. In some ways, you're at the forefront of this battle to protect natural spaces. I've seen that you work a lot in the field of forest conservation in Lebanon. How do you get young people in particular to see the benefits of protecting those spaces, especially now that people are focused on, in Lebanon specifically, on getting a job and perhaps even staying safe from COVID?
And this is what exactly I want to mention. First of all, I'm really honored to be with you today and to raise the voice of the Lebanese young people. Last thing you've heard about Beirut was the horrible Beirut blast, the revolution and the enormously corrupted system that is taking away from us our basic needs. I'm not going to be very negative, but I really need to talk about the challenges that we are facing here as a young Lebanese people, and want to show you the potential that we have if we are all well supported sustainably and in a very independent way. So as you might know, Lebanon is a small country, but is rich, really rich, by biodiversity in flora, fauna, and responsible NGOs that are replacing the role of the government right now, and rich in very advanced universities, educational institutions, and a very ambitious young generation that is really aiming high despite the current situation. So on the ecological level, our beautiful green nature is suffering and needs serious protection. Sadly, it is not right now a priority in Lebanon, as you said. It is suffering from corruption first. We have laws, but they are not applied because of political reasons. Our forests suffer from deforestation, fires, annual fires, pollution. The people are really dumping garbage in the valleys and forests without a serious eco-friendly plan for this garbage. We suffer from overhunting, overexploitation of natural resources, illegal quarries, and many, many other problems. This is on one hand, and on another hand, we have recently the poverty, which is reaching a 50% rate currently, with a very high unemployment rate too. So I'm sure you've heard about the economic inflation and how much the Lebanese pound is worth now. So when we think about solutions here in Lebanon, we need to plan the programs on different levels: social, environmental, agriculture, because when people understand the real socioeconomic benefits of forests, they will accept to protect it. So Heike, I'm gonna tell you a small story about a young man named Wael. Wael is a man, poor man, living in the northern mountains of Lebanon. He has a small family, but he is really poor. He cannot even afford food, to buy food for his family. So of course he cannot afford to buy fuel to heat his house during the snowy winter. So what he does is cutting trees to heat the house. We cannot tell Wael, no, please do not cut the trees. Trees are important. He will ask why. My family is a priority. So if Wael is involved in our programs, and if he is touching the return of investment of the conservation programs, he will be involved and he will accept to protect the forest in his village. So I used to work with a very active NGO named Juzur Lubnan. We worked on reforestation, conservation, research, agroforestry. We have like plenty of data about biodiversity, the flora, the fauna of Lebanon. And I am currently coordinating on an agricultural education program for youth and adolescents with AFSI Foundation. So I see clearly the need for the agricultural sector, at the same time, the environmental and forestry, and the need for food production, food security, and sustainable agriculture and exportation, because we cannot import anymore, because we need dollars to import the basic needs of the Lebanese. So if I want to think about solutions, there are, for the young people, for example, I really recommend the EU and other grantors or institutions to tackle the young professionals' employment issue as they tackle the gender issue. This will create like plenty of job opportunities for us to stay in our country, live and be stable here in Lebanon. Please support awareness-raising projects. People need to know the importance of the nature of Lebanon in order to conserve it. 3, monitoring and evaluation of environmental projects on the long term when done. This will help show the real return on investment to these local people. 4, enhance research and data collection to draw the perfect way for programs, especially because here the national strategy is a bit weak. 5, empower small local businesses, producers, farmers to secure food, seedlings, and sustainable income, not only during the project, but for the future. And 6, empower and create more wildlife encounters to raise awareness on the importance of the wildlife and its conservation, because I personally know only one encounter in Lebanon, which is established by my professor. So as you can see, there are plenty of solutions. We only need a good path or track, funding, and empowerment for us to continue on the same path of the senior experts here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rita. Let's open up a little bit of debate if we can. Sandy, I would love for you to pick up on some of the issues that Malta raised earlier, and maybe we can kind of center it around this 30 by 30 goal. And just for the benefit of our viewers and participants, it's this goal to protect 30% of natural land and sea areas by the year 2030. Could and should we be creating more protected areas when we, in many parts of the world, just don't have the money or resources to protect the ones that are already under threat?
I think the answer to that is yes. And the pandemic has really reinforced humanity's unsustainable relationship with nature. And 30 by 30 is an essential effort that, by protecting 30% of the Earth's land and waters, this will enable us to address simultaneously the 3 existential crises that we're faced with: the health of people, as illustrated by the pandemic, climate change, and biodiversity. But it matters, where do we protect that 30%? And we absolutely must make sure that science informs which places we select, and that at the heart of these protected areas are the most ecologically intact ecosystems. That is going to be both the most cost-effective and the most functionally effective way to ensure that 30 by 30 succeeds. Second, we need to connect protected areas with other sorts of conservation areas. And because protected areas alone in a landscape of development or a sea of development will not work. And I think the way that we can achieve 30 by 30 is through innovative partnerships. And I'm encouraged by a number of efforts. For example, 8 countries in Mesoamerica, plus the Green Climate Fund, the EU, the Global Environment Facility, and more than 50 indigenous peoples and more than 20 primarily Creole people have come together to create a plan of action to conserve the 5 great forests of Mesoamerica. So these are the last big intact forests Mesoamerica has, but that plan includes not only creating new protected areas, but better management of existing areas and of the lands in between them. Another really encouraging example is the new Legacy Landscapes Fund that was announced last month by the Germans. And this is not only an innovative partnership, but it's a sustainable financing mechanism for existing protected areas. So the Germans envision this as a $1 billion fund that will support 30 by 30. So the aim is to provide funding for 30 of the world's most ecologically significant protected areas at $1 million a year for 30 years. So this will address the issue that Malta raised, that most of the places that are protected now don't have the resources to be managed effectively. So already many partners have joined the Germans, philanthropists, as well as other governments. The French Development Agency has just joined, and the Wildlife Conservation Society is very honored to be one of the partners in the Legacy Landscape Fund. I'm convinced that these kinds of partnerships that span governments, civil society, philanthropy, bilateral and multilateral donors are the way that we're going to succeed. These problems are too big for any one of us to go it alone. And the kinds of partnerships we're beginning to see, like Legacy Landscapes Fund, the Blue Action Fund, Nature Africa, the EU, the new EU initiative, and the EU Key Landscapes for Conservation. These are the kinds of partnerships and the kinds of ambition we need to ensure that 3030 succeeds and that humanity has the nature we all depend on now and for future generations.
Great, thanks, Sandy. And I might get Rita to pick up on some of those funds and solutions that you mentioned. But Humberto, I'd love to get you to help us talk about those innovative partnerships that Sandy mentioned, and money. We know the private sector will be key to help us deliver on these big goals. I wonder what kinds of creative financing solutions you think work best.
Well, thanks for the question. Actually, it's a very important one. I've listened with a lot of attention to this needs of financements for proper management of protected areas. Indeed, if we have more protected areas not effectively managed or not cherished by local communities, we won't get there. So I can tell you one case study, if you want. We have launched in the past wave of EU funds. We did have a test financial instrument. It was called the Natural Capital Financing Facility, precisely to capture what are the potential businesses, activities that foster nature, rely on nature, while providing benefits or reducing costs. And I can tell you, it's easy to get very good ideas. It's less easy to make them bankable, marketable, because we all know we depend on the ecosystem services that nature provides, for sure, but many of those ecosystem services are for the wider society, are not really captured for a direct human activity or business, while some are. So in this sense, I think this kind of initiative, when we mix public finance to reduce the risk, so as to bring in the private actors that may see a way for their activity to extract value from the land while protecting it, the land or the sea, that's the way to go. We need to go more and more into a regenerative economy that not only diminishes the impacts, it gives back where we have taken too much. And I think also a key word not to forget on this angle is adding to protection. We do need more restoration to put back healthy ecosystems where they were degraded, and we know that human action can as well have this role on putting it back. In a nutshell, financing will remain fundamental. Resource mobilization will remain a key issue for international negotiations, including on biodiversity, and we in the EU are very conscious of that and willing to keep track on the doubling that we have assumed and achieved up to 2020 and beyond, so that we can all together move towards protection, restoration, and sustainable use. That's what we need.
Thank you, Humberto. Malta, it seems like we've heard a lot about different funds, the German Legacy Landscapes Fund, lots of creative financial solutions. Is it easier said than done to kind of create those partnerships with these other institutions, funds, businesses, or is it much more complicated than that? Do any of the solutions look attractive to you?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for the information. I said when I received the invitation for this event that I like these events because it's where you get empowered and get information from experts. Thank you very much. I listened with interest, and this sounds very interesting. Partnerships, yes, are the key factor in achieving big goals like this one. Partnerships, I agree, I fully agree. But if we can look at this as a totality, if we can look at what ambition we're setting ourselves for, it's many things. Yes, it's resources. Yes, it's capacity. Yes, it's all these other issues that have been spoken about. But also the time frame is another key factor. In 2010, we set ourselves for a decade to achieve the Aichi biodiversity targets, 10 years. And out of those 10 years, we could not achieve 17% of covering the terrestrial with protected areas. And we didn't achieve 10% to do marine protection. Now we are saying, passionately saying, we must add 20% to marine and we must add about 13% to terrestrial. And those are the figures we didn't manage to achieve in the past 10 years. And considering the impact of the pandemic currently, we are left with 9 years. And actually, I've just heard in a meeting I was in yesterday that there is a possibility to move the COP15 to 2022, meaning by the time we approve the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we will be left with 8 years to implement it up to 2030. So what we couldn't achieve in 10 years, we are saying we will achieve in less than 10 years, and we are going to achieve double that target in less than 10 years. That is unrealistic and doesn't sound achievable, no matter how many partnerships we can manage to put together. There are other issues that I have raised. Fortunately, I am an environmentalist and I believe in conservation. It's me who wants more than 30% protection of the land and more than 30% protection of marine. But on the ground, when you look at this issue on the ground, how much time will we need to resolve the land claim issues first as a starting point? We can have 100 and numerous other partners, but how much time are we going to need to resolve the social issues on the ground that we are faced with, particularly here in our country and other parts of Africa? Secondly, where is the land? Do we have the land, that extent of the land? We will have to move people, we will have to change land use, we will have to move certain activities that are being done to ensure that we declare national botanic gardens, etc. All those issues. When you put them on the table, you may have partnerships, you may have resources, but there are other issues around the declaration of protected areas or other effective area-based conservation measures. When you are on the ground, which you are faced with, we declared 21 marine protected areas in 2018 in South Africa. And it was a landmark and it was celebrated during COP14. But let me assure you, those 21 protected areas, which amounted to 5.4% of the Aichi biodiversity targets, still need a lot of work because community consultation is still an issue. The provision of alternative means of survival to coastal communities is still an issue. Developing businesses to enhance the less take from the sea and more dependent on other economic means is still a problem. I mean, partnerships are good. Resources are made available by the generous donors. But when you are on the ground and you are actually involved in the setting on management of these protected areas, there is a lot, it's more than that. And if we look at this ambitious target we want as environmentalists, we look at this ambitious target that we want, and we look at the time frame that is being set, I'm telling you, each country will have not to give a target, national target, that is significantly less than the global target. That's the calculation we are currently discussing in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, that if we want to reach 30 in 2030, every country must ensure that as a minimum, it sets its national target to be 30%, meaning everybody must not be less than 30%. Everybody must be 30% or more if we are to reach 30% global target by 2030, which is 8 years from after the COP. So there are many issues that we need to consider, and I hope we would all understand that it's not a matter of being not agreeable to the target. As I indicated, I would appreciate seeing 50% of the earth and 50% of the marine environment under protection. But the big question is, given the time frame that we have, is that achievable? Is that doable? Is it realistic? You can give somebody $1 trillion to do work, but if you consider other factors, is it doable? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. Then if we are saying it's doable, and consider all these other factors, land claims, the state of the existing protected areas, the consultation that is still required to be done in the existing marine protected areas, etc. We sit down and be realistic. Is that doable? That's the big question we have on the ground. We don't dispute the target, but the question is it realistic? Is it doable, considering the time frame that we are setting for ourselves? We're not having 20 years to do it. We have less than 10 years to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malta. I would love to come to you now, Rita, but we are approaching our Q&A segment of the session. And there is a question that I think you might be able to help us answer. As Malta mentioned, being on the ground, that kind of insight is so important in applying all of these strategies. So someone has asked, what role do you see for Indigenous communities in achieving the protected areas targets? So locally, how do you see communities applying the policies necessary to reach these targets?
Actually, it is their land. So if you are working on protecting a forest in a small village, you need to count on the local community to protect it. So from the bottom, when you start with the community by raising awareness among them, building their capacities, ensuring that their needs are met. If you help them to understand how to manage the forest, how to benefit from the forest, maybe for ecotourism, maybe you train them to be guides. So if the people really understand what they have, how rich are their resources, and how much they can really benefit from it if they conserve it, not cut it or overexploit. So in this case, they will be very, very helpful, because we're not always on the ground. We're not always on field. We need someone responsible from the local people to take the lead, or lead or manage when our project is done, because everything that we are doing needs to be sustainable and maintained in the future.
Thank you very much, Rita. Humberto, I want to pick up on the 30% target and what Malta was speaking about, which is, this is incredibly ambitious for some countries. What does that 30% mean? Obviously, we want to go bigger, 50% protected areas by 2030. The time frame is difficult. What does that 30% mean? Is that a bare minimum, and what happens if we don't reach that globally?
Okay, that amounts to what does realism mean? Because in fact, what science is telling us is that 30% is the bare minimum. We likely would need more. So here, this is also on discussing what's realistic. The need is also an element of realism. Now, what Malta said is, of course, a series of difficulties that do exist to increase the number of protected areas and to manage them effectively. But here I would do an important distinction. At least in Europe, and I'm sure elsewhere in the world, having a protected area does not amount to putting people aside. Sometimes rather the contrary. Often we need local communities, indigenous people, to keep the sustainable activities to which nature has adapted and that often are actually required to maintain nature. So it's an issue of getting the right balance of what activities and where, so as to have protected areas. Of course, a different issue is when certain ecosystems require nature to be left essentially undisturbed, where human activity, or at least extractive activity, is reduced. But let me give you one example. In the EU on land, if we count the EU-wide network of protected areas plus the nationally designated on land, we are close to the target. We are around 26%. We have a lot of effective management that still needs to be done, that's for sure, but it doesn't seem unrealistic. You could look to the ocean and think, is that realistic? When you are around 10%, you want to go to 30%, which is the case in Europe. And I would say there, it seems so because indeed one of the main uses of the ocean, which is fisheries, actually benefits from protected areas. It's now crystal clear that we all get an agreement with the fishermen and fisherwomen communities that there should be a place which is protected that no one takes, so a no-take zone that usually ensures more fisheries productivity outside the protected area, because fish will get bigger in the protected area with more eggs, more larvae, there's more fish to fish elsewhere. So this is this issue of converting the goal of protected areas into wider socioeconomic benefits, with for sure a lot of dialogue with the local communities that can bring the apparent unrealism to the realism that science tells us you should get there.
Thank you, Humberto. Sandy, Humberto raised that we are close to reaching those land targets in Europe. What's the picture like in the rest of the world? I know you've traveled extensively. Are you hopeful?
I am hopeful. And it's also important to remember that much of the world's intact ecosystems, the big areas remaining today, are on indigenous lands. And it's because of the roles that indigenous peoples have played in safeguarding those lands, that those ecosystems still exist. And conservation has started to recognize that respecting and empowering indigenous peoples' rights and guardianships of ecosystems is essential. They have to be at the core of the solution. We have to empower indigenous peoples and local communities to be able to access financing mechanisms directly, and for their voices to be heard and their rights to be respected. Globally, WCS works with over 200 indigenous peoples and local communities, and our approach is to support and empower their vision for conservation of these intact systems, and to help them access finance. And I'm encouraged that conservation really is beginning to change, and that the role of local communities as guardians and stewards of nature is a proven means to conserve ecosystems. And so we must have them be at the forefront of shaping the solution for 30 by 30.
Thanks, Sandy. And in some ways, I feel like Rita is one of those stewards. She's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in her community. Rita, how tough is it for you to create that awareness? Because I think we all know awareness is one of the first steps in trying to bring about that kind of change and that action. Could you just describe the campaigns that you're leading?
Believe or not, it's really not difficult, because it's first a passion. Because before being a work or a job for me, it is my passion. So when you cascade the info and the passion that you have to the people in front of you, it's like it's contagious. I have organized many awareness campaigns on the social media, on TV, radio stations, with companies and students, scouts, organizations. Once you start being realistic with them, but at the same time showing them how much you believe in the nature, in Lebanon's biodiversity. And when you tell them that we are not conserving these lands for the environment only or for trees, no, we are conserving it for our well-being and our healthy lives, they will understand and will raise our voice to other people. Okay, is it an alarm? So that's it. Over to you.
A signal that our session is coming to an end, but I'll give you 20 seconds and then we can wrap up.
So really the awareness sessions are fruitful when you say it.
Oh, looks like we're having some.
It.
Thank you, Rita. I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. It's really been a useful discussion, though, to get every one of your perspectives and experience. And I think it's clear, as the commissioner said at the beginning, we do need that Paris moment and that big master plan to focus everyone's efforts, because conservation is such a complex problem. But we need to do that, as we've learned, by listening to local communities, with, of course, the help of creative financing solutions to make it easier for countries like South Africa and Lebanon. We've got a couple of minutes to go, I'm told. Humberto, I'll give you the floor for one last word.
Well, the last word is I would enlarge this concept of partnership to indeed a worldwide partnership where we understand both the need for more protected areas, also the need for support to getting there. I think that we are in good conditions to get to that in the global biodiversity framework, because of the very unique political moment when this link between protection and restoration of nature and climate change as two twin problems that we'll need to tackle together is coming in also from nature-based solutions. Also, the financing opportunities for climate funding and biodiversity funding will be closer together. So let's keep spirits high, because we will need to get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Humberto, indeed. Thank you all very much. And Claire, it's back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Sandra, very much for that interesting panel discussion.